Hello, my research class. Welcome to another class. Today we're going to be reviewing and discussing quantitative research. Now, let's go through this PowerPoint that actually I organized it in order to put a specific structure and perspective to our reading on quantitative research and makes a good summary of the videos that you have watched already. So let's look at what we have in this PowerPoint. Mainly, I wanted to introduce you with the concept of quantitative research versus qualitative. In quantitative, you really need to think of quantity and analysis based on giving specific statistical numerical data versus qualitative research, which looks at an in-depth study of a specific phenomena and then gives you a narrative or gives the reader a narrative of what is an explanation or description of what the nature of the phenomena is. But in quantitative research, I'm looking at numbers, I'm looking at statistics, I'm looking at frequencies, degrees, values, in order to give a final results of what could be reasons or what could be the situation in a specific experiment or a specific study of a situation. Now, I want you to think of the model, conceptualize the model, and in the picture here, it really gives you a description of how it looks like, the structure of quantitative research, and I made it here. So I took this picture right here and I tried to make sense to you in a linear. So if you are a visual person, this will make sense to you. The purpose leads to a specific your problem and your question leads you to highlight your purpose, and from there you move to studying the literature out there that supports your argument or your purpose, and from there you write your questions and hypotheses and then start your methodology section. Then you discuss your validity and reliability. And if you want a more linear structure of this, then this is how it looks like, and this is basically how your research paper will look like in a quantitative research. And we know by now that both qualitative and quantitative have the same structure. There are some changes in the quantitative which are not the bolded format right here, but the bolded format are basically the same format of a qualitative research. So both qualitative and quantitative start with an intro, starts with the statement of your problem and your purpose, and you discuss your questions, right? Then you come up with, research your literature, you write your methodology, and then validity and reliability, or what it's called trustworthiness in qualitative research, right? So intro, questions, I probably need to switch that. Hang on with me. Questions comes before the literature, and then literature, research, and then methodology, and then validity and reliability or trustworthiness in qualitative research. So we agree on the same structure, right? But in quantitative research, there are slight differences that I'm going to explain to you right now. In the questions of quantitative research, the questions itself carry what's called variables, and we're going to discuss in a minute what is the meaning of variables and what are the different types of variables. Okay, and then after you state your questions and you stated using the variables in your questions, you have to state your hypothesis. And your hypothesis is what you think or predict or presume will happen at the end as a result. In qualitative research, we don't have these two. We only write the questions, right? So we have the intro, the problem, the purpose, and questions in qualitative. In quantitative, when you write your questions, you want to make sure that your variables are clear. And after you write your questions, you write your hypothesis of what you think might happen. Okay, now in literature review, it's exactly the same literature review, and whatever you've done already is exactly the same, and you can use it here for qualitative or quantitative research. Okay, when we come to methodology, if you remember, under methodology, write an intro, your sampling, your data collection, and data analysis. That's exactly the same. And I'm going to, you know what, I'm going to do it like italic. These are the common, exact same structure of qualitative and quantitative research. Okay? Let me, here we go. And then data analysis. The italicized subheadings are common between qualitative and quantitative. So when we come under methodology, we write an intro of what is this kind of methodology or type of methodology design that we're using. For qualitative, you say case study, historical, ethnography. We have 5 types, right? For methodology in quantitative, I'm going to tell you exactly what we're going to do. For sampling, remember the video that we have watched already under qualitative. We're going to watch it again, but we're going to study the quantitative section, which is at the beginning. So again, we write about the sampling, what kind of sampling that you're going to use. And then data collection. Under data collection, you write your procedure of what you're going to do, and then you're going to procedure. Let me write that. Tools, and then how your tools are administered. Semi-structured in qualitative, but structured in quantitative interviewing, and so on. And we're going to get to discuss in depth what are the data collection tools. And then data analysis for qualitative. Remember when we talked about coding and EMIC and EDUC, perspective and categorization and all of that. In quantitative, guess what? It is not about how you think about things or how your participants think about things, but actually your analysis of data based on numbers, and then you quantify it at the end with specific values. And for that, the data analysis, you're going to watch a specific separate video on data analysis, which is the only new thing. So the whole video is reviewing what you've already watched in the videos and read in the chapters, but then when we come to data analysis, it's a completely different chapter and completely different PowerPoint that and the PowerPoint I'm going to add under with this PowerPoint. Then we come to validity and reliability discussion. In the trustworthiness, there were some specific terms like comfort, transformability, credibility, all of that. But in validity and reliability in quantitative, you'll talk about the external and internal validity and reliability and consistency of the data collection and data results. So if you can see, there isn't a lot of changes in the structure. The structure is the same. It's just the filling. The content is a little bit different. So let's entangle all of these new things, and I'm sure that you already read it, and I'm sure that you already watched the videos. So again, it will be kind of a good review to just polish things up, hopefully. Research questions and quantitative research always followed by hypothesis, and they really have specific types of design. So in quantitative research, we have 3 types of research questions that lead to the 3 types of research designs, types or designs under quantitative. There is what's called descriptive research questions, there is comparative research questions, and there is relationship-based research questions. In the descriptive, from the word descriptive, you really aim to quantify the variables you're interested in. You want to give numbers to the variables. In a comparative research, you're examining the difference between 2 or more groups of dependent variables. And then in the relationship-based questions, you are looking at cause and effect, causal relationship or association relationship. Let's take each one of them and discuss each one in depth. Descriptive questions is really referring to the non-experimental research type of design. So if you choose to do a non-experimental quantitative research design, then you will probably, your questions will have to be descriptive questions. So you'll ask questions like how much, how often, what percentage, what are, so what, how, this kind of questions, and you're looking for a rate or a percentage at the end to describe the variable. So let's look at a question, an example question, an example descriptive, non-experimental quantitative research design. And I hope I'm not going too fast. So you have your question, what are the most important factors that influence the career choices of Australian university students? Okay, now your variables are factors that influence career choices. Okay, that's what you want to assess or research, okay, or explore. The group that you're going to study is Australian university students. That's who you're really interested to know more about. Okay, here's another question. How? So see, this one started with what, this one started with how. How often do male and female British university students upload photos and comments on other users' photos on Facebook each week? So the variable is weekly photo uploads. We have 2 variables, weekly photo uploads and weekly comments on other people's photos on Facebook. You have 2 groups, males and females, from the same British university. Okay, so British university students, I want to look at males versus females. Okay, so that's a descriptive question of a non-experimental research design. Let's look at a comparative question, and that's mainly a quasi-experimental research type of quantitative research design. Such questions typically start by asking what is the difference in a particular dependent variable. Why is it messed up? Sorry. Example, daily calorific intake between 2 or more groups, American men and American women. So you want to compare 2 groups and you want to know the difference, and that's the keyword right here. If you want to compare, then you're comparing between 2 groups and you want to know the difference between these 2 groups. So let's look at question. What is the difference in the daily calorific intake of American men versus women? And then here the question is, what are the differences in usage of behavior on Facebook between British male and female university? I just took these examples from online and they're written in British spelling. Question here, a difference in usage behavior on Facebook between British male and female university students. The dependent variable is the usage behavior on Facebook, and the groups are males and females. See the difference between description? I want to know how things are happening or what is happening, but in a comparative, I really want to know the difference between two comparable groups of participants. In the relationship, which is the experimental design, we typically start a relationship-based quantitative research question with what is the relationship, followed by between or amongst, or then you list the independent variable and the dependent variable. So the independent variable, for example, can be gender, and the dependent variable can be, for example, attitude or interest, amongst, and you list the groups. So let's see the first example. Question will be, what is the relationship between gender and attitude toward music piracy amongst adolescents? The dependent variable is attitude towards music piracy, and the independent variable is the gender, and the group we're studying are adolescents. Now, we're going to discuss in a minute what is variable and what is the difference between dependent and independent variable. And I just want you to look at the stronger, or the one that we're manipulating, or the one that we really want to know the difference between, which is the stronger one. It's the independent variable. Okay, the one that a researcher wants to manipulate and wants to know really more about in that relationship. The dependent is what's affected by the independent. Okay, what I want to know the influence on is the dependent variable. So I want to know the influence of gender on the attitude. Okay, the attitude differs from one gender to another. Okay, so you manipulate the stronger variable, which is the gender, and you want to know how this affects the attitude. That makes sense. Okay, let's look at another question. What is the relationship between study time and exam scores amongst university students? Now, take a minute, don't look at the variables, and let's see. If you see what is the relationship, then it means that I'm asking an experimental relationship question, right? Between study time and exam scores. These are my two variables. Which one is the stronger one? The one that I can manipulate. I study more, I study less. Okay, so that's the independent variable. Okay, now which one do I want to look at how it's affected on, or how it's influenced? It's the exam scores. So the more I study, the more scores are higher, for example. So whatever you push is independent, and whatever you see the results on is the dependent. I think it makes sense now, I hope. So the variables are these two elements in your research questions. One of them is an independent and one of them is a dependent variable. The independent is usually the one that you can manipulate to check its influence on the dependent, which shows the outcome. Okay, and these two variables, these two pieces of variables, or usually a variable, is seen in your research question in quantitative research. If we look at a comparative question, you'll find the dependent variable really clear, but not necessarily an independent variable. So let's look at this. What is the difference in the daily calorific intake of American men and women? We have only one variable here. The difference in the daily calorific intake. Now, the daily calorific intake is that's the outcome of that's basically, I'm testing one thing. I want to see the difference between men and women, and I want to see the intake from here to that, from this one to this one. So it's really a one variable, and not necessarily I want to call it dependent or independent. It's just a variable. Okay, so in comparative questions or quasi-experimental, you'll most probably find one variable I want to test, I want to look at, because what matters to me is the comparison of two groups, not necessarily the variable. The variable is what I'm testing, but I want to see the two groups, comparing the two groups. The same thing in the descriptive question. You want to describe how often this one variable happens between or in a specific group of people, or within one specific group of people, or one situation. So here I might actually take out, let me take this out. Oh, oops, undo. I don't want you to be confused, but it's just a variable. Now, in the relationship, there have to be two variables, because you are discussing the relationship between two in two different situations. Okay? This is an explanation of the independent variable. Its manipulation or variation of this variable is the cause of change in other variables. So the independent variable is the one that you manipulate, change around in order to see its outcome or its effect on a dependent variable. Okay? Now, obviously, the independent and dependent variable have strong relationship, because you cannot specify independent variables without specifying the dependent variables specifically in the relationship questions or experimental type of research. It actually dictates the whole process of the research. If you have two variables, if you have one dependent variable, if you have one independent and one dependent, so it really dictates what you're going to do throughout the research. Okay, so we discussed, we talked about purpose, literature, and questions, and within the questions you really need to include what's called variables. So we discussed the difference between dependent and independent variables within the different types of questions. So purpose, literature, or purpose, questions, literature. When we come to questions, there are three types of questions. Each question dictates what kind of variables that are included in the format of this question. Relationship is the one that has both independent and dependent, but comparative and descriptive questions, which are done quasi-experimental and non-experimental research, these two only have one type of variable, which is basically a dependent variable, because it shows an outcome more than anything. But the independent is more of the manipulation of a specific situation or a specific variable. So purpose, literature, questions that include variables. And let's go to the next. After you write your questions, you need to state your hypothesis. And your hypothesis, as we said, it's your presumption of what might happen in this research. Now, there are two types of hypothesis. There's this directional, which you are precisely saying what's going to happen, which one will have more effect than the other, or which one will have high effect, and or which variable is going to show what is the exact result or correlation. So that's the directional, when you're really precise. But in the non-directional hypothesis, you're just saying that there will be a relationship, but you're not sure what kind of a relationship. Is it a strong? Is it opposite? Is it what kind of relationship? You're not specifying. You're just saying that you think there is a relationship. Now, the hypothesis has to be stated in a measurable or testable prediction. So you have to say that study will show that there is large or minor, or if you really want to be precise, you can say 50% relationship in an experimental, or there's a strong correlation between longer hours of study and high scores in testing. You have to show some sort of measurable language in your hypothesis to match the quantitative format or nature. This is what we just talked about, the directional and non-directional. The directional is more strong, the non-directional, the directional is more precise, the non-directional is just states that there is a relationship and there is a difference, but you're not saying exactly what kind of difference or what kind of relationship. We talked about this, how it should be testable, and you usually have to say it as a tentative presumption of what the result might be. Now, the third kind, which is the null hypothesis, is not really something that you state at the very beginning. The null hypothesis comes at the end, or when you're just saying that you think there will be no. Null, the word null here means zero. Let me see if I can highlight. Yeah, or change the color at least. The word null means zero. So you can state in your hypothesis that you think there will be no difference between males and females in uploading pictures on Facebook, for example. Or in your results, your hypothesis, your null hypothesis can come at the very end to say that there is a null correlation between. So the word null is really strong in its indication of the zero effect, or the zero relationship, or the zero comparative analysis between your groups or amongst your groups of study. So three kinds of hypothesis: directional, very specific and precise; non-directional, which are usually just saying that there is a relationship, but you're not sure what kind of relationship; or there is a null, which is nothing. Null comes from nothing. No correlation, no relation, no comparative analysis, nothing. Here is the null hypothesis. Okay, so again, let's go back to, is it this one? Yes. Introduction, problem, purpose, questions that include variables, and the variables are based on the type of question. If it's comparative, if it's descriptive, if it's relationship, the variables are based on the type of questions. And then after questions, you state your hypothesis, whether it's directional, non-directional, or null. Then you talk about your literature, and then we come to our methodology. Okay, I hope it's clear, and we know the types of variables: independent, dependent variables. The independent is the one that you manipulate, and the dependent is the one that you want to look at the outcome or the result as an effect of are influenced by the independent variable. Okay, let's look at the methodology. Methodology was which slide? Okay, methodology. Now, as we said, and as you saw in your videos, there are 3 kinds or types of designs in your methodology design of quantitative research. Okay, like what we had in qualitative when we talked about the different types and designs, which are case study, ethnography, historical, grounded theory, I can't remember, ethnography, case study, historical, grounded theory. These are the things that we have studied, and these are the types of designs in qualitative research. Now, in quantitative research, we only have 3 types of designs. Okay, experimental, quasi-experimental, and non-experimental. In the experimental, the research question will be the relationship question, if you remember. The quasi-experimental, the question will have to be a comparative question format, and the non-experimental, it has to have a descriptive question format. Okay, now what is the difference? In the experimental, they always call it the true experiment. It has everything from an experiment in quantitative research. The quasi-experimental, it's like a semi-experimental, which has some of the features of a quantitative experiment research. And then the non-experimental is really barely making it to be a quantitative. It's like a borderline between quantitative and qualitative research. It's like as if you're studying a regular qualitative research, but you want the results to have specific numbers, so that's why it's a quantitative research. You're analyzing the data. When you come to the analysis, you're analyzing the data based on numerics, and that's what makes it non-experimental. Okay, so experimental, quasi-experimental, and non-experimental. The experimental design has to have there has to be independent and dependent variable. We just discussed this, that in an experimental relationship experiment, we have to have dependent and independent variables, and the independent variable is always manipulated. Okay, so that's the first one. The second thing is that we always randomly select samples and randomly assign these samples. Now, there's a difference, and the book discusses this. There's a difference between random sampling and random assignment. Random sampling is if, like the book was discussing, if you're looking at obese females, for example. Okay, so you are randomly selecting a group of obese people. Okay, let's take away that female and male. I'm going to do that in the assignment. So there are, in a specific job, say if you want to study the effect of obesity in the teaching profession. I am completely making this up, so I apologize if it doesn't make sense, but I'm just trying to have you think of the names of each one of every aspect of this purpose of research. Okay, so the relationship between obesity and efficiency in teaching. Okay, so that's your experimental research. Now you have an independent variable, which is the obesity. That's the one that you are manipulating, and you want to see the outcome on the dependent variable, which is the efficiency in teaching. Okay, so you have an independent, you have a dependent variable. Now your groups are going to be randomly sampled. I'm going to look at obese teachers in Fairfax County Public Schools or Frederick County Public Schools. Okay, let's stay in Frederick County Public Schools. Okay, so you're going to randomly select obese teachers from Frederick County, and then you're going to randomly assign them into two groups, maybe males and females. So you're just randomly selecting females in this area and randomly selecting males in this in this group. Or you can just randomly select randomly assign into two groups of participants, not necessarily males and females, but you just want to make sure that the majority of females is not in one group, or the majority of female is not located in that group. And for sampling, I want you to go back to the video, and I'm going to provide a sample, a link of the sampling video later on in the slides here, just to make sure that you go back and watch this. It's very important. It will give you specific terminology of your sampling, what kind of random sampling and what kind of random assignment. Okay, so the distinction between random sampling and random assignment is the selection. Random selection is the selection of participants, but the assignment is the assignment of groups. Okay, in the experimental research, you are randomly selecting and randomly assigning to groups. You are providing a treatment. One group will have a treatment, which might be teachers losing weight and following a specific diet, and teachers who are still in the same obesity criteria. I am completely making this up. This is not even, I don't know if this is a research that you want or can research, but it's starting to be to seem funny. So but I'm just trying to make this up. And you're going to see is this affecting it? You want to have observations, surveys, and collect your data to see if obesity has any effect on efficiency of teaching versus teachers who are following a specific diet have less efficiency in teaching or more efficiency, or there's null hypothesis and there's no difference between obese or non-obese teachers, really. So the treatment will be giving them a specific diet and see if there is any efficiency results, increase or decrease or null. Okay. The variable we talked about, and then the tools are the data collection tool. How do you decide now to collect data? You want to see if there is an efficiency, right? So what kind of data collection tools are you going to use? Probably you're going to use surveys to ask specific questions and see how they do things. And how do they feel when they're teaching? Is there any obstacles, health obstacles while they're teaching? So this could be a tool. You can use structured observational tools where you're going to have specific criteria, and then I'm going to discuss this in detail in a minute when we come to data collection, and collect your data. Okay? So that's an experimental study. I had treatment, I had variables, I have tools, I have groups that are randomly selected and assigned, okay? And I have questions that are looking at relationship between the independent and dependent. Make sense? Okay, let's look at the quasi-experiment. Now in the quasi-experimental, you're really not, you can be randomly selecting, but you are not, and I highlight not, randomly assigning them. They have to be naturally formed. Okay, so there is only a control group that you're having, and then the other group is just completely naturally formed. I really did not randomly assign them, so they pre-existed already. There will be treatment, but there is no manipulation of independent variable. In the quasi-experimental, if you remember the comparative, the difference, okay, so what is the difference between teachers who have teachers of good health or teachers who are obese in Frederick County Public Schools, okay? The treatment exists, but there's no manipulation of one independent variable versus the other. There's only one variable that I'm studying, and I am not comparing two variables to each other. I'm not manipulating one to see the outcome on the other. I'm just looking at what is happening for this group of people. Okay, in the non-experimental, there is no manipulation, and there are no cause and effect. So the quasi-experiment is exactly the same as the experimental, except for two things actually. One is the random assignment, and two is the variable and manipulation. If there are two variables, then there is a manipulation of one versus the other that has the outcome, right? But we agreed that in quasi-experimental comparative questions, you only have one variable that you are studying, so de facto would be there is no manipulation. Okay, so random assignment, random selection, but no random assignment. That's first difference. And the second difference is that it's only one variable and no manipulation, but there is a control group that is exposed to a treatment. Okay. And then in the non-experimental, there isn't any kind of comparative groups. There is no, you're just describing, or you want to know how this thing is happening or what is happening. You're just describing based on data, describing a situation based on data. Okay. And let me I have this graphic organizer to just kind of make sure that you understand the difference between the true experimental and quasi-experimental. The non-experiment has nothing of that, so I didn't include this in the graph, or I don't think it needed to be included here because there is nothing of the natural experimental. It's only called experimental because it has a descriptive data based on numerical or ratio or percentage value. Okay, and this is a summary of what I have just done. So, purpose, questions with variables, hypothesis, literature, methodology, and under methodology we have two things. The design, three things actually. The introduction, where you're going to tell me what kind of design, which is this, and then data collection, and then data analysis. Okay, three things under methodology. Methodology, the design, the type of design, the data collection, the data analysis. The data collection, the design, we learned about it. It's either experimental, quasi-experimental, or non-experimental, which match with the questions that the question kinds that we've just discussed with the examples. Okay, in the data collection, we are going to talk about what kind of sampling and what is the treatment. You're going to tell me about your procedure of selecting your samples and then the procedure of applying the treatment. So in the data collection, sampling and treatment, and you can include your procedure or have your procedure as an independent subtitle. But for this specific quantitative research, I feel that the procedure can come under your narrative here under sampling and treatment. Now, this is the link of the video that I have posted under qualitative research to look at sampling of qualitative, and we looked at the last half or the second half of sampling when we talk about qualitative. Now this time you're going to watch the first half of quantitative sampling, the different kinds of quantitative sampling, and I want you to use the language and the terminology when you're writing about your sampling. Then you're going to tell me about the treatment that you are going to use if there is a treatment. For experimental, do you have a treatment or not? Yes, you do. For quasi-experiment, do you have a treatment or not? Yes, you do. In non-experimental, do you have a treatment or not? No, you do not. Okay, so if you are choosing a non-experimental, then you're not going to have this section right here. Okay, so sampling, and then so please watch this video. Just not to repeat myself, I'm going to have to wait for you to go to this link, watch it, and then come back and we'll talk about the tools. Okay, now that you have watched the video, you're coming back to listen to the data collection tools. Okay, data collection tools. There are a variety of data collection tools, and they really depend on the type of design that you're choosing. So for experimental research, most often, because it's an experiment, you're probably going to have a pre-test and post-test, because there is a treatment, there is an experiment between two groups, and you want to know the relationship between your independent and the effect on the outcome on the dependent. So pre-test and post-test is something seen more frequently under experimental design. Also, surveys and observations can come under experimental design. Okay, now quasi-experiment, you'll find yourself doing either these three, or you can also do interviews. In the non-experimental, you find yourself obtaining data, information from a system. Survey, observation, or interviews are also used, but pre-test and post-test, they're not used in non-experimental because you don't have an experiment to see before and after, basically. Makes sense, right? In the interviews and observations in quantitative differs from qualitative research. And if you remember, in qualitative research, you really want to dig deeper and see the depth of data that you can collect from your participants. You always wanted to have a semi-structured or really not structured interviews where there is a flow. You're looking for the flow, and you're looking for following up on specific questions when there is a specific answer, right? For observations, you can have observational notes, but that's about it. You're just looking, you're going there. You have specific things that you want to look for when you go to a classroom or to a specific or a school or to wherever the setting is that you want to research, but you're just taking observational notes, free, full of description kind of observational notes, right? Because you want to confirm, you're looking for confirmability between your interview's discussion and what you've seen in reality. But again, in quantitative, it's very structured. It's not like that. You build in specific criteria based on your hypothesis, and you're looking for them when you're observing. So you want to see that students now are doing better because they studied for longer time. So this is one of your criteria. Students are answering the same questions, but they're answering it faster. Students are needing to open notebooks or to check for answers before they were able to answer questions. Some sort of criteria, basically, that you're having when you go to your observation and you're checking them and you're putting some specific notes, but the observation should be very structured, based on criteria, stemmed from your hypothesis and your questions. Okay, surveys and questionnaires, they're qualitative, we call them mainly questionnaires, and in quantitative, we call them surveys. In questionnaires and qualitative, you are not numerically collecting the data, you're just looking at what you, or interpreting what you can interpret from the answers in the questionnaires. But in a survey, they're very data-driven numerically, where you actually can insert data in Excel sheet or specific, SurveyMonkey or specific survey websites or softwares where you can have results numerically at the very end. So that's more quantitative. The obtaining data information from a system, it's basically looking at specific data inserted in school system, and you are making correlations and making meanings and driving some numerical data from these pre-provided data in the system. So if you want to look at the influence, the relationship between SES and success, so you want to look at the data information that you have about on the SES of your students in the school, and so that's when you obtain these data information from the system, and then you make that correlation, obtain other data information from the system on their test score, standardized test, and then make the correlation between these two, the SES and their score per student. That's a data collection, and that's basically descriptive, or you can use it also in quasi-experiment. Okay, now each one of these is written in detail, more even detail than I have just explained in your chapter 7. Okay, but I think because it's an introduction to research, I really don't want to dig any further deep. I just want you to understand these. Okay, and the data analysis, we go to the data analysis, and that's, as I said earlier, it's a completely separate chapter in your book, and that's what you needed to read for this week. And a complete different PowerPoint lecture that I'm going to add under this week's reading and lecture. So, but in general, the data analysis is in quantitative research is based on finding numerical data and statistical data, you can use softwares as SPSS and NVivo, which you're going to hear more about it later in the video. I probably read about it in a chapter as well. And there are 4 levels of measurements you need to specify when you're talking about your data analysis. Is it nominal, ordinal, interval, or racial, or scale-based? And again, please go and check the lecture, the separate lecture. Check separate lecture. I'm editing as I'm talking, as I'm giving you the lecture here. But anyway, so check the lecture on Blackboard for data analysis. Again, just not to repeat myself. Now for data analysis lecture, it is really a guest speaker that I have invited for you to explain more the data analysis because she is very well immersed in the quantitative data analysis field, and I thought that she can give you a more detailed feedback on how to do the data analysis. I can give it to you, but I wanted to give you an expert who did several times data analysis, and her name is Dr. Sarah Mahdi, and she's from the American University in Washington, D.C. So I hope that you'll find the lecture helpful in giving you more details on data analysis, statistical analysis right there. Then, before we come to the validity and reliability, I wanted to say something that now just to make sure that you understand, let me go back to the structure of your paper again. So intro and purpose, questions with variables, hypothesis, literature, then methodology. In the intro, you're going to tell me what type of design, experimental, quasi-experimental, or non-experimental, and link it to the questions, how the experimental, I mean, as I linked it for you when I talked about the types of questions, what kind of question shows, or how the type of question is really linked to the type of design. If it's experimental, then it's a relationship questions. If it's quasi-experimental, then it's a comparative, causal comparative question design. And if it's a non-experimental, then it's a descriptive or correlational research design. So you need to talk about this. And then you're going to, in another subheading, you're going to talk about your sampling. Again, watch the video for the sampling and talk about your random sampling, random assignment, or just random sampling if it's a quasi-experimental, or no randomness in your selection if it's a non-experimental. So you're going to tell me about your sampling, selection and assignment and procedure, and then tell me about your treatment under sampling, because the treatment happens within the groups. So if there is a treatment within the groups, if based on the design, again, then you need to discuss it here. And then the data collection, you're going to tell me, you're going to explain your procedure, the tools that you're going to choose, and please, when you put the tools, put them in subheadings under the subheading of data collection. So you'll have subcategories. Look at OWL Purdue to see how is this formatted. And then how are you administering? In the book, it talked about interviewing and surveying and the different administration of these tools. If you are doing it face-to-face, if you are doing it on the phone, if you're doing it via Skype, if you're sending it by mail. In quantitative research, you have this kind of luxury, but in qualitative, you really want to have this close relationship with participants, so you're usually a face-to-face, just because your data analysis is always based on your interpretation, either EMIC or ETIC. So without having this kind of close interaction, you're not going to be able to analyze it. But in quantitative, you really don't need this personable relationship. So you can have your surveys or interviews via phone or computer-based, or like SurveyMonkey, or phone, Skype, by mail. You can send them the survey by mail or the questions by mail of an interview, and then they can send it back to you, so that's more flexible. And then data analysis, after you watch the guest speakers lecture, you're going to be able to write your data analysis. And here we're really not going deep. If you take a quantitative research class, an independent class by itself, a course by itself, you're going to dig much deeper into the statistics of data analysis and quantitative research. But for now, I'm really trying to look at the surface of it. And then comes the last piece, which is validity and reliability. Reliability is the consistency in procedures, okay? How you're collecting your data, how you're measuring your data, all of that. This consistency between the pre and post, for example, shows your reliability shows the reliability of the research. The validity is really the truth to what you're measuring, and the truth to what you wanted to measure in relation to the question or the hypothesis that you've discussed at the beginning of the paper. There are two kinds of validity. There is an internal validity and there is an external validity. The internal validity is the variation that shows that there is some sort of a problem or an error. So there might be factors that are not measured in testing, for example. Maybe the test you gave them in the pre-test, students know it by now, but then when you go to the post-test, they do better just because they are familiar to the questions now from the pretest. So this is a factor that is not measured, and it could be influencing the internal validity of your measurement at the end. Personal factors, selection of maturation. So if it's a longitudinal research, which means it happens through a long time, then there might be some sort of change or factors in your participants themselves. They're changing, they're maturing, there's something happening in their lives. Could be a variation in differences in situational factors. Situation differs from your pre-test to your to your post-test. Different weather, different setting, or one of the participants, something happened to him major, like death or depression or whatever, and they leave the research and the treatment, and then the other participants are either less in number, or they're affected or influenced or hurt by what happened to one of the participants. So this is situational factors. The situation happened within the process of the treatment to your groups. Difference in administration. Maybe one researcher did the administration and then somebody else did the administration the next time of the treatment, and then again something might be affecting the internal validity. Number of items measured. You really want to not to exceed in numbers, just to make sure that you are in control of of your measurement, not out of control. Lack of consistency between treatments or data collection tools. Something happened in the consistency. Something happened in the procedure of collecting data that influenced results. Statistical regression, and that's when an extreme low scores or an extreme high scores, or a huge difference between the before and after the treatment. This is called statistical regression, which shows that there's something fishy, something is going on in the data collection or the treatment or in the analysis. So you have to address these as part of your internal validity. Now, external validity is only related to samples. Can I generalize my population? Can I say that all teachers who have this situation influence this specific kind of score? Or in all situations, when you study really hard, the score will come out. So really, it's about generalizability of your population or of your setting. Okay, so can I generalize my results? If not, then there is a problem in the external validity, and you have to tell me why, what is happening. Versus, of course, qualitative research, there is no generalizability. It's based on specific case to specific participants. But in quantitative, the whole purpose of doing quantitative research is to find numerical or statistical reasoning or answers for a generalized situation and a generalized population. That's my review for quantitative research. We talked about the format, we talked about forming questions, we talked about the hypothesis, the methods, which are sampling, data collection, and data analysis. And data analysis piece is something that you're going to study in a different lecture with our guest speaker. And we talked about the different types of designs of the quantitative research method and the validity and reliability of quantitative research. I'm going to post this with the data analysis video for this week. All right. Hope you find it easy, and please let me know if you have any questions.